Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. I would like to begin by thanking Louise Muir, our President and CEO, Agnes Sue Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and Pam Schaffler, our Chair Emerita, and all of our trustees, in particular the champions of our library, Patricia D. Klingenstein, Sue Ann Weinberg, and Sydney Lapidus. We also acknowledge the generosity of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, Helen and Robert Appel, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. The Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at New York Historical is one of the oldest, most distinguished research libraries in the United States. It holds millions of books, newspapers, maps, manuscripts, prints, photographs, and architectural collections. It is a vital center of research into the history of New York and the nation. Key to that research is the presence of a yearly rotation of scholarly fellows, both in residence and in a short-term capacity. Our fellows are engaged in advancing knowledge as they mine New York Historical's collections for new ways of interpreting the American past. We are most fortunate to have them in our midst. Tonight's program will give you just a taste of the quality of work that is being done. Building New York in the Gilded Age will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Elizabeth Blackmar is the Boies Professor of American History at Columbia University. She is the author of Manhattan for Rent, A History of the Formation of the 19th Century Housing Market, and with Roy Rosenzweig, The Park and the People, A History of Central Park. She is joined in conversation by Alexander Wood, the current Helen and Robert Appel Fellow in History and Technology at the New York Historical Society. He received his PhD from Columbia in 2020 and previously studied architecture at the Cooper Union. He's currently working on a book about the construction of New York in the late 19th and early 20th century, a project which is under contract with the University of Chicago Press. Welcome.
Thank you, Valerie. And it's good to see you, Alex. And to the audience, I just want to say that you are getting a preview of what is a fabulous book that is exactly the kind of book that every New Yorker loves to read. Alex is Building the Metropolis, Architecture, Construction, and Labor in New York City, 1880 to 1935, is really the first book I can think of that actually explains the city building process from the conception of designs all the way through the laying of bricks, the introduction of new technologies. It explains the finance of building. It explains the construction and contracting process. And most of all, it just brings alive in a remarkable way an industry that had an enormous impact on transforming the city's landscape in this critical period. And Alex explains it all. So I've had the privilege of reading the dissertation and the first 2 chapters of the book, and I can tell you it's a fabulous read. And we're going to get Alex to tell us about what he's been thinking about, how he's been writing this book. And I'm going to throw him some questions that just let him talk about a book that I can't wait to assign. So Alex, one question, and the program tonight's focusing on the Gilded Age, and you make a point that there really is a transformation in the process of city building that takes off in the 1880s. And I thought we should just start with your telling us why that decade is so important and what the big changes were and what, sort of what it is about the 1880s that really redefined the entire process.
Yes, Betsy, thank you. So if you look at the history of New York's built environment, about its if you look into the history of its physical growth, one of the first things you notice is that it's not a steady, continuous process of building, of city building, that it occurs in these huge booms, in a sense. We see that after the Erie Canal was constructed. We see that in the 1850s, somewhat after the Civil War. Well, the 1880s is another one of these sort of great building booms in New York's history, which followed about a decade of depression. And generally speaking, when the economy is in depression or recession, there's less building. And then when the economy revives, you start to see more building. So first of all, in the 1880s, there's this period of sort of a rapid accelerating economic growth, and that sort of translates into building in New York. At the same time, you sort of have a convergence of several decades of technological development within construction itself. I'm thinking of, for example, the development of structural ironwork, the development of the passenger elevator. In the early 1880s, we start to see the first applications of commercial electricity in buildings. And so I would say that although New York has gone through these cycles of boom and bust, in the 1880s we see the beginning of an incredible building boom combined with really the culmination of all of these technological changes in building and the New York building industry. Architects, builders, contractors sort of use that technology, put it together, really, I believe, for the first time in order to deliver buildings as efficiently and as profitably as possible.
And you get the new building type of the skyscraper. So how did the skyscraper bring it all together?
Right. So in my research in this book, I begin with the skyscraper, which makes sense. It's one of the defining building types of New York. New York is famous for its skyscrapers. The skyscraper is an exceptional building type. They tend to be the most expensive buildings, the most technologically advanced buildings, et cetera. But in my research, I also want to show that by looking at the tall office building, that we also learn about the economic forces that shape the development of the built environment. So the skyscraper, in a sense, is a kind of an extreme case of what happens on a lot of city lots. To go back to your question, one of my favorite quotes about the skyscraper is this quote from Cass Gilbert, who was a New York architect that practiced at this time. He described the skyscraper as a machine that makes the land pay. I love that quote because it emphasizes, first of all, that most skyscrapers are built as income producing properties. They're built to make money by creating office space that people then pay for. The second point that I like about that quote is that it emphasizes that these buildings make money because they're built in particular locations where people are willing to pay a premium to be. So, as would make sense, the demand was particularly high to be in lower Manhattan in the late 19th century, primarily due to the location of the financial sector. All of those banks and capitalists from California and Chicago that moved into New York, all of the businesses that wanted to have an office close to the money market, wanted to be in this one location, which generates the demand, so to speak, for a tall office building. As I point out in the book that I'm working on, these skyscrapers are very interesting to look at, not just because of the engineering feat that they represent, right? That they're really tall and they use new technology. I think people understand that. At the same time, these architects and builders and contractors that specialized in creating tall office buildings, they learn how to build them very quickly. So whereas the first tall office buildings in New York, in my view, really the first skyscrapers built in the early 1870s, like the Western Union or the New York Tribune building, they took about 2 or 2.5 years to build, mostly because they were still somewhat experimental structures. They were completely safe, but no one in New York had built anything like this before. By the early 1880s, architects like George Post or general contractors like David H. King, who then went on to work with McKim, Mead and White a lot, learned how to build these buildings within a year, within the span of a single rental season, right? So, for example, Darius Ogden Mills, who was a big California banker that moved to New York, built one of these early skyscrapers. He acquired all of the land on Broad Street in April. He had contracts signed with his architect and builder in May. And on May 2nd, he started tearing down these properties on this very valuable land. And by the end of the year, a skyscraper was completed.
And open for rents.
And open for rents, yes, for moving day.
So, one of the things that is amazing is in describing the Mills building and how it was produced in 1 year, you really look at the process at all levels, from the architect's office down to the building trades, but also all of the suppliers. And one of the things that's just fascinating about this book is to recognize that the building industry in New York was a regional operation. I mean, you show that at some moments it employed as much as 10, even 20% of the city's labor force, but not just in the physical work of construction, also in all of the supplying. And I have to say, the thing that is really remarkable about your discussion of all of the facets that go into producing a single building is the research. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit how you figured out which brickyards supplied the bricks, and which where the sand came from and where the granite marble came from, because I don't think we've really appreciated the extent to which a regional economy really underwrote the production of a new skyline.
So in a project like the Mills building, or any building, actually, any building in New York, there's a building lot, there's a site, and one of the main organizational challenges, let's say, one of the main tasks of the architect and builders and contractors is to get workers and materials on that site, because buildings are built in place. And I think, as most people can understand, the building industry is highly local. Most of the firms that built New York in this period were New York firms, but none of the materials that went into buildings were actually produced in Manhattan itself, let's say. You have terracotta plants in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. You have the historic brickyards in Haverstraw, which is up the Hudson River about 40 miles. So as you're saying, Betsy, there's this whole sort of landscape, metropolitan landscape, that makes up the building industry. I started this project by looking through the project records of architecture firms like George Post, McKim, Mead and White, Cass Gilbert. Actually, the New York Historical Society has wonderful collections of the business records of these architecture firms. And the vast majority of these papers are the correspondence between architects, builders, and subcontractors. Just thousands and thousands of pages between Charles F. McKim and Otis Brothers. When are you going to deliver our elevator? It's late. Did you get our drawings? Just this back and forth. And I guess I would say, Betsy, that just over time, I sort of built up a kind of database to track the firms. I mean, the Otis Brothers, that would be an obvious one because they were one of the first elevator companies. Edison, the Edison Illuminating Company, that's another obvious one. But there's a whole world of businesses that don't exist anymore that were critical firms in the construction of New York. And I guess just by looking at the project records, looking through newspapers, looking through trade publications, over time, you get a sense of the firms that existed, which ones were the major firms. You start to get a peek into this kind of vanished world of the construction industry. And there were many thousands of these firms. I would say hundreds of firms within each trade, so to speak.
And you, I have to say, you know, when we're dealing with supply chain problems, you have a wonderful description and we all recognize this today. If you're ever on a New York street at 2 a.m. and see the trucks barreling in, but the ways in which at night all of these supplies are being delivered, but much of it by horsepower, and so the logistics of getting iron, bricks, sand, everything that's necessary on site in order to meet this timetable itself was really an amazing story.
Yeah, I mean, I know the detail you're referring to. One of the most interesting things is about learning about the sort of modernization of the construction industry is the way that builders and contractors extended the working day essentially by working into the evening. In the chapter, I explained that at the time, they didn't construct buildings at night, which would have been viewed as dangerous, but all of the materials, especially for these big skyscraper projects, would come in at night on horse-drawn carts, as you're saying, Betsy. All of the debris during the day would be cleared away. So in a sense, you have this increasingly regular production process going on at the building site. The dream of transforming construction into some sort of factory-like process is ever present, and it's never been reached for various reasons. But you can see how these techniques of this sort of the mentality of management, let's say, starts to get applied to construction.
And what is truly the case is that one of the reasons they don't ever succeed in turning it into assembly line is the story you tell of the building trades themselves in the 1880s. And again, for those of you, I mean, I know in our audience, we have enthusiasts of architectural history and of business history. We haven't really, there isn't much historiography that has successfully brought the labor story fully into the production of a new New York City landscape. And this is something that Alex does quite well. And what's interesting to me is the way in which the issue of time is equally important to the laborers in the 1880s as it is to the investors in these new buildings who want them to go up in 1 year so they can start collecting rent. On the other side of that story are the building trades and how they understand the issue of controlling time as essential to their own well-being. And Alex, why is it that the building trades successfully make time the question of the 1880s, the working day? It may be that the architecture firm, everything is being run on a 24-hour schedule, but the labor movement's calling for 8 hours and the building trades are at the forefront of that. So how did the labor part of this story come into play?
Sure. Well, Betsy, as you know, this started out as a history of architecture in a sense, and actually through conversations with you in class and outside of class, I realized that it had an urban historical dimension. I just say this because I didn't start out with an interest in the building trades or in labor history per se, but you quickly discover in the late 19th century that being a construction worker let's say by the turn of the 20th century was virtually synonymous with being a union member. And I realized that if I was going to tell the story of the building industry, that I would need I would need to make what's happening in the building trades itself the heart of the story. So if I rewind a little bit and go back to the importance of time, not just in skyscraper construction, but especially so, we have the beginning of this building boom in which buildings, the vast majority of buildings in New York are built to earn some type of income. Oh, sorry, just.
Okay.
Sorry. There's an enormous demand for labor at the same time to build all these buildings, for skilled labor, for construction workers that have training in different trades like ironworking or carpentry. So we have these sort of buildings that need to be built by a certain time. We have this high demand for labor. And what we see is that beginning in 1883, 1884, the building trades starting to revitalize the trade union movement in construction, using the fact that buildings need to be built on time, that they're built according to a seasonal sort of cycle in the late spring, the summer, and early fall, and basically using that to orchestrate very carefully timed strikes at the very height of the building season, right when all of this many millions of dollars worth of construction sort of hangs in the balance, and using that in a sense as leverage very successfully in the early to late 1880s.
And beside the 8-hour day, what are their demands? I mean, what is labor seeking out of this process?
Well, the 8-hour day, first and foremost, higher wages. In the early 1880s, the building trades essentially were still getting paid the wages of the Depression 1870s. There had been an incredible deflation in wages. So the 8-hour day, higher wages, I think maybe just as important to the building trades, which at the time were relatively well paid to most wage workers. Sometimes people view that as a way to describe the building trades as an aristocracy of labor.
Mhm.
That's a term from Marxist historical scholarship. I personally view that as more of a reflecting on sort of how poor the living conditions were for other workers, rather than thinking that the building trades had it great. What they also wanted was power at the workplace. Before the revival of the building trades unions, employers could hire and fire people completely at will. There were very few safety precautions on a New York construction site, which became a problem as buildings became taller, as more machinery was used. Essentially, construction became more dangerous. So just to return to my point, I would say that the building trades wanted power at the workplace, and they saw joining trade unions as a way to lower hours, raise wages, have power at the workplace, and to become a part of this sort of revived labor movement.
And one of the things that you show is the way in which the building trades introduced new organizing tactics, the walking delegate who would go from site to site, and the boycott. I mean, they're very much part of the wider 8-hour movement of that period, but they do want to maintain closed shops, and that has implications for thinking about the building trades for other kinds of buildings. I mean, your group, these unions have enormous leverage in the context of very expensive projects on a tight timetable, where basically the general contractor is going to make concessions. What about the other kinds of buildings that's going on that you talk about in the city at this time? For example, the tenement construction. How do you compare the building process between these skyscrapers that we today know and love and tenements that become the kind of generic landscape exactly in this same period? Can you just, this is a little bit beyond what your two chapters did. I know it's in a
No,
coming
no,
chapter, but I do think it's fascinating to see the way in which you account for the stratification of the building industry and the building trades in this period.
no, I think it's a hugely important phenomenon because we see this stratification, as you call it, continuing today. In fact, in a big construction market like New York, essentially the building trades unions focused on organizing the workers that would build skyscrapers, that would build the Dakota, that would build those large houses on Fifth Avenue in this period. Those are the workers that created unions, that organized for them. Those are the kinds of workers they wanted to organize first. I think for different reasons. One reason is that the general contractors and contractors that built those buildings were willing to deal with the unions, even if they were very much opposed and tried to stamp them out. But essentially they weren't able to because the building trades unions just were disciplined enough and they pestered them enough that, they sort of lost that battle. But because these were viewed as the respectable contractors, who I think had some responsibility to the trade and to the idea of workmanship, the building trades unions and these contractors would form a sort of relationship going forward. All of the industry agreements that covered the construction industry in New York were formed by these parties. But at the same time, for example, in tenement construction, which if you look at the number of buildings built per year, by far tenements were the most prominent type of building created in New York in this period. And by and large, union construction workers did not, I would say that union construction workers were not officially sanctioned to sort of operate in the world of tenement construction. The contractors that built tenements were not viewed as respectable contractors. I would say that there's a sort of Venn diagram where they overlapped clearly, but the impression that I've gotten doing the research is that the vast majority of the speculative builders that built tenements, as well as some row houses and modest flats, operated sort of outside these agreements that the building trades unions were able to win.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that was a source of enormous sort of controversy.
Well, it's something, as you say, that does persist today, and to see this long history of a kind of, the sort of legitimate, if you will, building industry, and then all of the activity that is producing so much of the working class neighborhoods of the city in this period, that on the one hand have these immigrant entrepreneurs, and on the other hand have the building workers who are not able to make the same kinds of gain and may not have the 8-hour day, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The other labor history you tell that in your dissertation was a real eye-opener to me. I think that so many of us think about buildings as designed by their architects. And you tell us the story of what goes on in architects' offices. And I'm wondering how your own experience and training, first as an architect and then as an architectural historian, entered into what is really a little bit of an iconoclastic narrative in terms of challenging the sort of story of the genius of McKim, Mead and White, right? I mean, you're opening it up to a much more complicated picture about how their offices actually ran. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Because again, it's just one of the really unexpected and fascinating dimensions of this book.
Oh, I appreciate that. Most architects in New York, or throughout American history that people have heard of, let's say after the Civil War, McKimmey and White, Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham and company, etc., or Frank Lloyd Wright. These famous architects that we know of, most of them operated large firms, large architecture offices. That makes sense. They had a high volume of work. They often designed big projects. Well, at the beginning of this project, when it was still a dissertation, I was very interested in looking at the great New York architecture firms and sort of getting inside of them, like cracking them open to see who is doing the work, what's going on in these firms. I didn't start it to try to prove that Stanford White actually didn't do anything or anything like that, but you start to see that these firms, even though they're quite small compared to the big businesses that existed at the time, McKimmey and White had over 100 employees in the 1890s, and that was unfathomably large in the world of architecture. Someone like Richard Upjohn, for example, who designed Trinity Church before the Civil War, he had about 6 or 7 employees, and that was considered big before the Civil War. So these architecture firms are pretty big businesses, and they have a lot of talented people working for them. And to make a long story short, these partners that we are familiar with, they were very busy drumming up business. They were very busy meeting with the president of Columbia University to talk to him about everything that was happening, on his project. And there's a sort of hierarchy of designers and specialists, as well as a sort of whole room full of draftsmen who are very talented. They contributed in ways that I believe I can actually identify in some of the work. They were also poorly paid for the most part. The architectural profession has changed a lot since then, but in a sense, it hasn't changed in the sense that architects are expected to enter these prestigious offices as a kind of an apprenticeship. The idea was that you wouldn't be a draftsman at McKimmey and White your whole life, but you would do this for a few years. You would go out on your own, and then you would start your own McKimmey and White.
Mm-hmm. It really is an interesting story, and I know that when you get to the 1930s, you have both the construction workers who had been marginalized and the workers in the architect's office basically linking arms in their protest about the building process. And it's a very interesting climax and also unexpected. Those are two groups you don't expect to see: the Harlem construction trades and the office workers and the architectural firms joining together.
Yes, that was a unique moment. There was architecture critics, urbanists throughout this time I'm looking at in the book, were relentlessly critical about many different aspects of city building in New York. Principally, they were critical of not just of the tenement, but of the fact that New York could not house its population. It continuously failed to provide affordable, decent housing for the vast majority of working people in New York. So I was familiar with that line of critique, all of that work. A similar type of critique, as we can imagine, was being generated from the labor movement and even from the building trades. In a sense, they saw this up close because most of them lived in the tenements. And so in the 1930s, it is interesting to see this CIO-affiliated union made up predominantly of architectural workers, sort of trying to form an alliance with, I would say, a more leftist, communist, organized building trades unions in the 30s, and trying to sort of come together to say, like, we're both part of the development process. Why haven't we been talking?
Mhm, mhm. So I know that we're going to have a lot of questions from the audience, but I'm interested in because this book shows that this was a transformative moment, this 1880s through to the Great Depression. I'm wondering if you think that in the contemporary period, there's a comparable transformation of the technologies and labor and finance of construction, or whether you see this history basically establishing the pattern that we continue to live with today. I mean, if you were to use your methods as a historian and go to the Hudson Yards, would you feel at home? Would you be able to recognize all of these different tensions and efforts at coordination, and or do you see that things have really changed dramatically yet again?
I think I would recognize a lot, and I do. When you read about the Hudson Yards, you read about the Building Trades Council, Greater New York. You read about the Building Trades Employers Association. I know we didn't talk about these things tonight, but these are the two main organizations of labor and the building trades employers in New York. And it's remarkable to me to read them having very similar debates as they had in, the night before the First World War. I would say that a big difference in my view is that today, a lot of what would you say, high class commercial development in New York, which really is the bread and butter of the New York building industry, it still is publicly subsidized in ways that it wasn't, especially not in the late 19th century. I would say that looking at early skyscrapers, for example, it's much simpler to me. The sort of economic decision-making that's going into it is much simpler. Whereas with the Hudson Yards, you have the BTC, the sort of combined building trades of New York City, is arguing for Hudson Yards because it's jobs. There's public subsidies and tax credits. I think I've seen a map where the tax credits somehow extend into Harlem because of the way that the legislature, the city council defines the sort of economic impact of these projects. And I don't want to say that early skyscrapers did not have some kind of political factors in their development, but I would say that the development process in New York now is much more politicized. It's much more, yeah.
You, in a sense, your history helps us understand why, because simply by showing the depth of the building industry within the larger city economy, we begin to understand the political stakes to the regional economy, as a matter of fact, of sustaining aggressive programs of development. And so if the particular structures of subsidies and the particular pattern of politics has changed, you do show us why this is such an important field of politics, because we see that the city, today we sort of very easily say, oh, well, the city is about finance, the city is about tourism, but it's still about construction. And that's one of the things that you really make apparent, especially when you see it freeze in the 1930s, right? I mean, the sort of devastating impact of the Great Depression is in New York, registered through the ceasing of, there's just no construction going on until WPA and PWA projects come in, and you convey that very powerfully, I think.
Yes, the Great Depression was an incredible catastrophe for the construction industry across the United States. In 1934, in New York, we have almost 90% unemployment. in the construction industry. So we're talking about several 100,000 people just not working for a few years, essentially. And obviously, the New York City was I was going to say benefited from the Great Deal, but more than that, Roosevelt, LaGuardia, all of these New York personalities, they delivered for the New York construction industry in a big way. And Robert Moses, and I guess in a certain sense, that public works economy that the city entered into, I guess it's never really left that.
Mhm.
As you're saying, construction is so important economically and politically to the sort of the way the city's politics works, is that these big construction projects have a very important public policy dimension.
Yes, and I mean, your book just helps us understand so much about the tentacles of the city building process that it's such an eye opener, and it's so beautifully narrated, and it's exciting. I mean, you feel the energy that is driving the construction process, these battles over who can control it. It's just a really amazing achievement. So I'm going to finish my questions by just asking you, what was one thing that really surprised you in your research? What is the most unexpected thing that, or a few of the most unexpected things that you uncovered that you hadn't thought about at all?
Yeah. One particularly surprising thing to me was to learn that the first general contractors are the ones that worked on these big buildings, like David H. King, who worked with Post. There were a bunch of them in the late 19th century. They initially fought the unions. They wanted, like I said, they wanted to stamp them out, as much as any employer has ever been opposed to unions. But over time, as the building trades sort of kept striking, kept building their power, these builders were put in sort of an odd situation with the owners who were paying them to build buildings. In the beginning, the owners sort of supported the builders, backed them up in order to let them delay the contracts. I was very surprised to see that at the end of the 1880s, these big builders essentially saying, you know what, these owners are not backing us up anymore. Why are we constantly fighting these battles on behalf of capitalists, real estate speculators, to fight these workers? I think that we can just get along with them. So that was one thing that surprised me, because the conflict was very intense in the early 1880s, and I shouldn't give the impression that they got along harmoniously. They didn't. There were constant struggles, but somehow those struggles came to be just an expected part of being in the construction industry in New York.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, you do late, there are later, as you say, later moments of intense, like 1903, intense conflict, but it is very interesting. I don't think we'd use the word collusion. I'm not sure we could use the word cooperation. It's something in between. But the groups that are actually getting the buildings up have to deal with each other, and it's fascinating to watch how they negotiate and the different kinds of tactics they can deploy. But also, I too find it surprising and really interesting to see the level of accommodation that the largest contractors give to the construction unions in order to get their projects up on time. So you have questions in
Yes.
Q&A, and I'm going to let you field them and answer them.
Yes. So we have 12 questions. I don't think I can get to all of them, but let's see. How and when did the construction industry become unionized? To what extent did unions succeed? Well, some of the building trades have had unions since the 1860s, especially amongst the, excuse me. Let me stop this timer. Some of the building trades had founded unions in the 1860s, but the 1880s was a moment in which the sort of trade union movement revived in the construction industry across many American cities. So I would say that the 1880s was the critical decade in which trade unionism became sort of durable in the construction industry. Can you discuss how high-rise apartments came into being for the upper middle class? Wow, these are big questions, actually. Well, the first apartment buildings were, there's a wonderful book by Elizabeth Cromley on this very topic. I would recommend the question asker to look at that book. I think it's called Living
Alone Together, Alone Together.
Yes. Essentially, they were developed in the late 18, or really the 1870s, the first French flats. And by the early 1880s, the Dakota, which was a very unusual apartment building, very, very expensive, very large, was one of the first of these sort of new monster apartment buildings. Did builders use the same suppliers? Excuse me, this is another question. Did builders use the same suppliers or did they bid out each other? I'm trying to understand what this question.
Did they take competitive bids or did they build ongoing patron-client relations with the same suppliers over time?
This is a great question. It's one that I have not fully answered. Essentially, these projects were put out to bid. So it was a competition between builders and subcontractors for these contracts, which were extremely lucrative. At the same time, I do notice the same firms showing up again and again, and especially in the sort of larger, more prestigious building projects, the same general contractors, the same subcontractors. That suggests to me that only a sort of handful of firms really competed for the biggest contracts. So I think it was a sort of limited competition. You know, I don't know if this makes sense, but as you move down into the world of apartments and row houses and definitely down into the world of the tenements, I would say it becomes much more competitive. So I think architects who are sort of in the driver's seat for a lot of these decisions wanted to work with contractors that they trusted, you know, as long as they had a competitive bid. But as a general rule, the lowest bid would usually win. Building owners typically think about that bottom line above all, whereas the architects and people involved are very cognizant of the fact that the lowest bid does not mean that it will end up being the cheapest. Was medical care at all a consideration? I assume this question is about the building trades. By the 1920s, a few of the building trades had started to offer medical care as a part of their sort of collective bargaining agreements, but I believe that did not become common until after the Second World War.
But it does seem likely that workmen's compensation, which New York adopted in the first decade of the 20th century, was heavily influenced by lobbying from the building trades, one would think, right?
Yes. So there are these New York State laws. Generally speaking, I've gotten the impression that the building trades did not trust the justice system and did not trust the sort of legal process. It must be said that they were very politically active. I would say that they sort of shied away from partisan political activity at times, but they did a lot of lobbying, as Betsy, you're saying. I guess I would need to look into that a bit more, because I have seen references to these workmen's compensation laws, and there are court cases about how negligent contractors running afoul of the scaffolding law which was an important law passed in 1885, due partially to the construction union lobbying, enabled the city to charge contractors with misdemeanors for unsafe building conditions instead of just a fine. On the other hand, construction workers seem to think that that law didn't really produce any effect. So,
well, and you show that accidents increased tremendously with, as you say, the new technologies of the 20th century skyscrapers. You've got 5 minutes and a whole bunch more questions.
yes, because some of these are hard questions. What led to a shift away from Beaux-Arts architecture in the late 90s, like into new styles? You know, I love this question because I think that changing architectural styles, changes in ornament, style is a bit, it means more than ornament, obviously. It refers to the entire look and form of buildings. I think that changes in architectural style actually change the building industry, right? Because the building industry exists to build buildings. As the sort of material composition of buildings change, right, that changes the firms that you need. McKim, Mead and White's Beaux-Arts work that needed lots of granite, right? Raymond Hood's work in the 1920s didn't really use all of that carved granite. So that had sort of downstream effects on the supply chain. The question of why it shifted, I don't know, but Betsy, do you have any ideas about this?
No, but I do think, you compare the municipal building as a Beaux-Arts skyscraper, and you're sort of relieved that they didn't try to go further with it. So maybe it just didn't translate into height.
Yeah. I'm going to do one more question. Are we so much slower to build now because of building regulations or because the materials come from farther away? Well, I love this question because essentially, yes, we're slower to build now. The Mills building, a 10-story building, was built in a year. The Empire State Building was built in a year, which the building trades actually viewed as reckless because I don't want to give the number and get it wrong, but I think more than 10 people died during the construction of the Empire State Building, mostly because it was built too quickly. I mean, it was built and it exists and it's a safe building, but it was built very quickly to sort of, for these economic reasons, as I was explaining. Now there is a sort of longer, sorry, what I'm trying to say. I don't want to give the impression that there are more restrictions that are somehow holding back some dynamic building industry that's about to rebuild New York and solve all of its problems. But there are more restrictions. There are more, safety is taken more seriously now than it was in the 1920s. There's a whole development process or public sort of review process on construction projects that did not exist then. And all of those things increase the time of development, I would say. As for the transportation of materials, that's an interesting point. I suspect that does add to the time of construction, although I wouldn't say it's the primary factor. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Betsy. That was great.
I just want to tell everybody that when this book comes out from the University of Chicago Press, I heartily recommend you get it. It's
Thank you.
lot of fun and it's fascinating.
Well, I think we could have gone on easily another half hour, but we have unfortunately run out of time. I want to thank Betsy Blackmar and Alex Wood for being with us today and for a fascinating discussion. Please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming fellows talks like this one. Finally, New York Historical Society is currently open Wednesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website. We hope to see you on Central Park West to view the new exhibition, Title IX, Activism on and Off the Field, and our numerous other offerings. Thank you again, and have a great night.